Hitler didn't choose Poland at random. Poland was the first target because it fit perfectly into his political, ideological, and strategic goals for launching a new European war. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles created the Polish Corridor and separated East Prussia from Germany. Hitler saw this as an open wound, proof that Germany had been humiliated. Reclaiming Danzig and reconnecting German territory became central to his early foreign policy. But the deeper reason was ideological. Hitler believed Germany needed Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe. Poland was the gateway to that expansion. If Germany hoped to one day conquer the Soviet Union, it first needed Poland out of the way. By 1939, diplomacy had failed. Poland refused German demands for Danzig and refused to join Germany against the USSR. Hitler concluded Poland had to be removed, not negotiated with. He also believed France and Britain would not fight. They had tolerated the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the destruction of Czechoslovakia. In Hitler's eyes, Poland would be no different. The final step was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. By securing a deal with Stalin and secretly agreeing to divide Poland, Hitler eliminated the risk of a two-front war. By Poland isolated and surrounded on three sides, Germany launched its invasion on September 1, 1939. 16 days later, the Soviet Union struck from the east. In just over a month, Poland collapsed. Hitler targeted Poland first because it was the easiest, most strategic, and most symbolic opening move. Conquering it cleared the path for everything he planned next.
When World War II erupted in North Africa, Britain wasn't looking for glory, it was trying to survive. The Desert War wasn't launched from a position of strength, it was a desperate gamble driven by crisis, fear, and the hope that a distant theater could change the course of the entire war. In 1940, Britain stood alone against Hitler. France had collapsed. The Mediterranean was collapsing, and the British Empire, stretched across the globe, suddenly had to fight with nowhere near enough forces to defend it all. Egypt, home to the Suez Canal, became the most critical lifeline Britain possessed. If the canal fell, Britain's connection to India, Australia, and its entire Eastern Empire would be severed. But Britain had a problem. They had almost nothing left to defend it with. Most troops had been lost or evacuated from France. Supplies were diverted to protect the home islands. The Middle East was undermanned, under-equipped, and barely prepared for a major war. Meanwhile, Italy's entry into the conflict changed everything. Mussolini saw Britain collapsing and believed he could seize Egypt, the Canal, and all of North Africa in one swift stroke. Italian forces in Libya outnumbered the British several times over. If they broke through, the Mediterranean would fall into Axis hands. So Britain made a decision that looked insane on paper: attack first. Instead of waiting for the Italian advance, British commanders launched Operation Compass, a small, limited strike meant only to delay Italy. What followed was astonishing. With inferior numbers but better training, better tactics, and far more mobility, British forces shattered the Italian army. In a few weeks, they captured more than 100,000 Italian troops and nearly overran all of Libya. What began as a defensive raid turned into a runaway success, and suddenly Britain looked like it was winning. But this victory triggered the real danger. Hitler saw the collapse of his Italian ally and reacted instantly. He sent the Afrika Korps under a relatively unknown general named Erwin Rommel. The arrival of German armor transformed the Desert War overnight. Britain, exhausted and still short on equipment, now faced one of the most aggressive commanders of the war. From this moment forward, the desert became a battleground of extremes: rapid advances, sudden retreats, and brutal supply shortages. Neither side could ever gain a permanent advantage. Britain kept fighting because it had to hold the Middle East at any cost. Germany kept fighting because Rommel believed victory here might knock Britain out of the war entirely. The North African campaign was never just about sand and tanks. It was the result of a strategic emergency, Britain's attempt to shift the momentum of the war at a moment when defeat seemed frighteningly close. The desert became Britain's gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than survival.
In 1941 and 1942, the North African desert seemed to belong to one man, Erwin Rommel. His sudden strikes, fast armored thrusts, and instinct for exploiting weakness repeatedly stunned British forces. Every time the British pushed forward, Rommel counterpunched harder. Every time they planned a set-piece attack, he outmaneuvered them. The Desert Fox looked unbeatable. But the first man to truly break Rommel's formula wasn't Montgomery. It was General Claude Auchinleck, the quiet, methodical commander who rarely gets the credit he deserves. When Auchinleck, the Auk, took command of the Middle East in mid-1941, he inherited chaos. Supply lines were stretched, morale shaken, and British forces had just suffered another defeat at Rommel's hands. The British High Command wanted a quick counterattack. Auchinleck refused. He understood something many others didn't. Rommel wasn't winning because he had superior forces. He was winning because he controlled the tempo of the war. Auchinleck's first task was to rebuild the Eighth Army. He reorganized units, replaced exhausted commanders, and demanded proper training in desert maneuver warfare. He insisted on stronger logistics, better coordination between armor and infantry, and a true defensive doctrine against German mobile warfare. His approach was slow, measured, and often criticized, but it was effective. Then came Rommel's most dangerous offensive, the drive toward Egypt in mid-1942. British forces were reeling. Tobruk had fallen. The road to Alexandria looked open. Many expected another collapse, but Auchinleck didn't panic. He withdrew deliberately, trading space for time, pulling back to defensive positions at the First Battle of El Alamein. Here, for the first time, Rommel's momentum hit a wall. Auchinleck had studied the Desert Fox's habits, his reliance on long, fragile supply lines, his tendency to overextend, and his belief that bold armored thrusts would always break the enemy. Auchinleck created a battlefield where those tactics no longer worked. In July 1942, the Eighth Army fought Rommel to a standstill. Auchinleck's defensive line held. His counterattacks struck at precisely the moments Rommel's forces were weakest. For the first time, Rommel's formula, speed, surprise, and deep penetration, failed. The Auk had broken the spell. But victory came at a political cost. Churchill, frustrated by the slow pace of the war and hungry for a charismatic hero, replaced Auchinleck before he could launch his follow-up offensive. Montgomery arrived and later won the Second Battle of El Alamein, but he did so on a foundation Auchinleck had already built. History often remembers the man who delivers the knockout blow, but it was Auchinleck who stopped Rommel's advance, stabilized the front, and proved that the Desert Fox could be beaten. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't flamboyant, but he was the first commander to crack Rommel's code and change the course of the Desert War.
By late 1941, the North African desert seemed locked into a pattern. Rommel struck fast, the British fell back, and the cycle repeated itself with brutal predictability. The Desert Fox's momentum looked unstoppable, Every offensive he launched pushed the British closer to Egypt and the vital Suez Canal. But all of that changed with Operation Crusader, the first major British operation that finally broke the rhythm of Rommel's advance. After months of setbacks, the British Eighth Army was rebuilt and reorganized. New commanders, fresh units, and restored supplies gave Britain a chance to regain the initiative. The goal of Operation Crusader was clear: relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk, drive German and Italian forces back, and shatter the sense of inevitability around Rommel's success. From the beginning, Crusader was different. Instead of rigid, predictable attacks, the British relied on mobility, deception, and flexibility, tactics meant to counter Rommel's own strengths. The operation began in November 1941, with British armored divisions striking into the desert to draw the Afrika Korps into open battle. The fighting was chaotic, fluid, and often confusing. Both sides took heavy losses. Commanders were cut off, units were scattered, and the desert turned into a maze of swirling tank battles. But unlike earlier campaigns, the British kept adapting. Even when early clashes went badly, they pressed forward rather than collapsing into retreat. The turning point came when Rommel, believing British forces were on the verge of collapse, launched a bold counterattack deep behind their lines. Instead of breaking the British, his move overextended the Afrika Korps. Supplies ran short, communications broke down, and for once, Rommel found himself reacting rather than dictating the fight. As British pressure increased, Axis forces were forced to abandon their positions around Tobruk. By December, the siege was broken. Rommel retreated all the way back to Alagala, his deepest withdrawal since arriving in North Africa. Operation Crusader wasn't a perfect victory. It was messy, costly, and at times dangerously close to failure. But it achieved something far more important. It broke Rommel's aura of invincibility. It showed that the Eighth Army, when properly supplied and aggressively led, could not only stop the Desert Fox, but push him back across hundreds of miles of desert. Crusader proved the Desert War would not be a one-sided campaign. It was the first major check on Rommel's momentum, and the moment the British began to believe that North Africa could be won.
In the deserts of North Africa, battles weren't just fought with tanks, guns, and artillery. Some of the fiercest clashes happened in rooms filled with maps, codebooks, and radio signals. Here, intelligence became as deadly as a cannonball. And the contest between British ultra-intelligence and Rommel's battlefield instincts was one of the most fascinating duels of World War II. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was famous for his intuition. He had an almost preternatural sense of where to strike, how to exploit weaknesses, and when to retreat. His rapid advances and bold maneuvers often left his opponents reacting desperately. For much of the war, his instincts seemed unbeatable. But Britain had a secret weapon: Ultra. By cracking the German Enigma codes, British intelligence could intercept and decrypt German communications almost in real time. Ultra didn't tell commanders what Rommel would do with perfect certainty, but it gave them critical clues about troop movements, supply shortages, and planned offensives. The intelligence war was a game of cat and mouse. Rommel relied on speed and surprise, trying to outguess the British. Ultra allowed commanders like Auchinleck and later Montgomery to anticipate attacks, redeploy forces, and sometimes set traps. It turned Rommel's advantage of instinct into a double-edged sword. He had to act quickly, but the British often already knew where he would strike. One famous example was during the lead-up to the Second Battle of El Alamein. Ultra intercepts revealed key supply movements and German attack plans. Montgomery used that knowledge to position his troops carefully, strengthen defensive lines, and plan counterattacks. Rommel, though brilliant, faced a battlefield where his intuition could no longer guarantee success. Ultra didn't replace skill or leadership. It didn't fight tanks or man artillery. But in the Desert War, information was as lethal as firepower. The intelligence war leveled the playing field, giving the British a way to outthink the Desert Fox rather than simply outfight him. In the end, the duel between Rommel's instincts and British intelligence reshaped the North African campaign. It showed that modern warfare wasn't just about courage or speed, it was also about knowing your enemy before they even move.
Erwin Rommel was one of the most audacious commanders of World War II. His rapid advances across the deserts of North Africa earned him the nickname Desert Fox. But no matter how brilliant his tactics, Rommel faced an enemy he could never outfight: logistics. The desert was vast, unforgiving, and full of hidden dangers. For Rommel, the speed and surprise that made him so effective depended entirely on fuel. Tanks, trucks, and supply vehicles consumed enormous amounts of gasoline and diesel. Yet Germany's supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of sand, vulnerable to Allied air attacks, poor roads, and the sheer difficulty of transporting enough fuel to keep the offensive moving. Rommel's army was constantly on the edge of exhaustion. A bold, armored thrust could fail not because of enemy fire, but because a column ran out of fuel miles from its objective. Supplies meant the difference between capturing a key position or stalling under the desert sun. Allied forces, aware of this vulnerability, targeted supply convoys whenever possible. Ports, depots, and transport routes became high-value targets. Every lost shipment of fuel forced Rommel to slow down, rethink attacks, or abandon opportunities entirely. Even the Desert Fox's legendary intuition couldn't overcome empty tanks. The fuel problem also shaped Rommel's strategy. He often overextended his lines to seize territory quickly, but the farther he moved from his supply bases, the more precarious his position became. Time and again, his daring offensives were limited not by British defenses, but by the harsh arithmetic of fuel consumption. Ultimately, the Desert War was as much about logistics as it was about tactics. Rommel's genius was undeniable, but in North Africa, the true enemy wasn't always a soldier across the battlefield. It was the distance, the desert, and the relentless need for fuel. An enemy Rommel could outthink, but never fully defeat. The lesson of the North African campaign is clear. Brilliance can win battles, but logistics often win wars. When we think of the North African campaign, we often picture tanks, artillery, and Rommel's daring maneuvers. But there was another enemy that fought alongside or even against both sides: the desert itself. Heat, mirages, sandstorms, and the sheer brutality of the environment shaped every decision, every battle, and every moment of survival. The desert was relentless. Daytime temperatures soared above 50 degrees Celsius or 120 degrees Fahrenheit, melting fuel, frying engines, and sapping the strength of men and animals alike. At night, temperatures dropped drastically, making sleep difficult and forcing soldiers to endure frost alongside the heat. Humans weren't the only ones affected. Vehicles, artillery, and even horses struggled to cope with these extremes. Sandstorms added another layer of danger. Visibility could drop to mere meters. Convoys became disoriented. Tanks bogged down, and aircraft were grounded. Troops could lose entire positions, not to enemy fire, but to a sudden wall of wind and sand. And then there were mirages, optical illusions that could make an oasis appear real or hide a critical supply convoy. Navigating the vast, empty desert became a test of both skill and nerves. Survival depended on preparation.
Water was precious. Fuel was precious. Supplies had to be meticulously rationed. Commanders had to plan every maneuver with the desert's unpredictability in mind. One miscalculation could leave a division stranded, exposed, or defeated without ever meeting the enemy. The desert shaped strategy as much as tactics. Rommel used it brilliantly, exploiting mobility and surprise. The British learned to anticipate it, setting traps and using terrain to their advantage. Yet no matter how skilled a commander, the desert always demanded respect. In North Africa, the real truth became clear. The environment could kill as surely as a shell. Heat, sand, and wind were enemies that could not be defeated, only endured. And those who survived learned that winning in the desert required more than bravery. It required mastery of the unforgiving land itself.
In the North African desert, battles weren't won just by numbers. They were won by tactics. And nowhere was this clearer than in the clash between Rommel's lightning raids and the Allied elastic defense. Two approaches, two philosophies, and a battlefield that forced both sides to adapt constantly. Rommel, the Desert Fox, thrived on speed and surprise. His lightning raids relied on fast-moving tanks, motorized infantry, and close coordination with the Luftwaffe. He struck before the enemy could react, aiming to disrupt supply lines, scatter troops, and seize key positions before resistance could form. Bold, aggressive, and relentless, Rommel's approach turned the desert into a vast chessboard of rapid maneuvers. The Allies, however, soon realized they couldn't always match Rommel in mobility or intuition. Instead, they developed the elastic defense. Rather than holding ground rigidly, they absorbed attacks, delayed the enemy, and struck back at weaknesses. Defensive positions were flexible, allowing units to fall back without collapsing entirely. Supply and communication lines were fortified, and reserves were kept ready to respond wherever Rommel struck. The interaction of these tactics created a unique rhythm in the Desert War. Rommel would penetrate deeply, expecting to annihilate forces in his path, but the elastic defense slowed him, absorbed the shock, and forced him to stretch supply lines dangerously thin. Conversely, the British could counterattack decisively once Rommel's overextension created vulnerabilities. This tactical duel came to define the North African campaign. Battles were not won by frontal assaults alone, but by the constant push and pull between attack and flexible defense, between speed and endurance, instinct and planning. Rommel's genius forced the Allies to innovate, while Allied resilience forced Rommel to calculate and adapt more carefully than ever before. The desert became a laboratory of modern warfare, and in this crucible, Rommel's lightning raids met their match in the Allied elastic defense, proving that mobility and boldness alone were not enough. Strategy, preparation, and adaptability were just as crucial. By mid-1942, the North African desert was a war of exhaustion. Rommel's Africa Corps had been slowed, but the British Eighth Army was battered, demoralized, and struggling to hold the line. The tide needed a shift, and that shift came in the form of General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery, or Monty as he was called, was nothing like his predecessors. Calm, meticulous, and demanding, he was obsessed with preparation, organization, and morale. Where earlier commanders reacted to Rommel, Monty planned for him. Every offensive, every defensive line, and every supply convoy was carefully calculated before it moved. He turned chaos into order and fear into confidence. One of Montgomery's first priorities was rebuilding the Eighth Army. Exhausted divisions were rested and retrained. Supplies, especially fuel and ammunition, were stockpiled. Communication and coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery were improved. Troops who had suffered repeated defeats
began to trust that victory was possible. Montgomery also studied Rommel intensely. Unlike other commanders who rushed attacks or counterattacks, Monty learned to anticipate the Desert Fox's moves, strengthen defensive positions, and choose the perfect moment to strike. His strategy was methodical: absorb the enemy's momentum, deny overextension, and then counterattack decisively. The results were immediate. At the First Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery's careful preparations held Rommel's forces in check. The desert, which had often favored German daring, became a place where disciplined planning could dominate audacious tactics. For the first time, Rommel was forced onto the defensive against a British army that was confident, organized, and ready to fight. Montgomery's arrival didn't just stop the Axis advance, it changed the psychology of the war. Troops now believed in victory. Supply lines were secure, and commanders acted with purpose rather than reaction. The stage was set for the decisive battles that would follow, culminating in the famous Second Battle of El Alamein, where Montgomery would cement his reputation as one of the greatest desert commanders of the war. In the harsh expanse of North Africa, it wasn't just tanks or aircraft that mattered, it was leadership. And with Montgomery at the helm, the British had found the leader who could finally meet Rommel on equal terms.
By late 1942, the North African desert had become a deadly chessboard. Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and the lifeline of the British Empire. But at El Alamein, the tide finally turned, and Rommel faced a battle he couldn't win. The stage was set by Montgomery, who had spent months meticulously preparing the British Eighth Army. Defensive positions were fortified, artillery carefully placed, and supply lines secured. Troops were rested, trained, and confident. For the first time in the Desert War, the British had not only the numbers, but the preparation to stand firm. Rommel, renowned for his daring maneuvers and lightning raids, found himself confronted by a wall he couldn't outflank. The narrow front between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression left him little room to maneuver. His supply lines were overstretched, his tanks worn, and his fuel dangerously low. The Desert Fox, accustomed to exploiting mobility, was now constrained by the terrain and logistics. The battle began in October 1942 with a series of relentless Allied offensives. Montgomery deliberately wore Rommel down, attacking weak points and forcing counterattacks. Every advance by the Africa Corps was met with coordinated artillery, minefields, and fresh reinforcements. Rommel's tactics, brilliant in open desert warfare, could not overcome the carefully prepared defenses. After 2 weeks of brutal combat, Rommel was forced to retreat. His forces were exhausted, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. For the first time in the Desert Campaign, the German advance had been decisively stopped. El Alamein became the symbol of Allied resilience and marked the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in North Africa. The victory was more than strategic, it was psychological. It proved that Rommel could be beaten, that meticulous planning could overcome audacity, and that the momentum of the war could finally shift in favor of the Allies. El Alamein was not just a battle, it was the turning point of the North African campaign, where leadership, logistics, and preparation triumphed over daring and instinct.
Erwin Rommel had built his reputation on audacity. Bold, fast-moving attacks in the deserts of North Africa earned him the nickname Desert Fox. His style relied on calculated risk, surprise, and relentless momentum. For a time, it worked brilliantly. British forces were repeatedly outmaneuvered, their supply lines cut, and morale shaken. But by late 1942, the same tactics that had made Rommel feared began to fail. The reasons were both simple and inevitable. 1. Overextended supply lines. Rommel's success depended on speed, but the farther his forces advanced, the longer and more vulnerable his supply lines became. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements couldn't keep up with his lightning thrusts. A brilliant attack could stall simply because trucks ran out of fuel miles from the objective. 2. Improved Allied intelligence. British code-breaking through Ultra meant Rommel's moves were often anticipated. His advantage of surprise was eroded as Allied commanders could predict attacks, reinforce weak points, and set traps. The Desert Fox was now fighting an informed opponent. 3. Stronger leadership on the Allied side. With commanders like Auchinleck and later Montgomery, the British learned to absorb Rommel's assaults and strike back effectively. The Allies built flexible defensive positions, improved coordination between armor, artillery, and air support, and finally had the discipline to withstand his rapid offensives. 4. The desert itself. The desert was unforgiving. Heat, sand, and mirages slowed Rommel's advance, damaged vehicles, and exhausted troops. Early in the campaign, these challenges were manageable, but by 1942, combined with the enemy's growing strength, they amplified his operational risks. 5. Exhausted forces. Rommel's troops were stretched thin, often underfed and overworked. Repeated attacks had taken a toll on morale and equipment. Even his legendary tactical genius couldn't fully compensate for worn-out divisions. By the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein, Rommel's gambles were no longer enough. The British had the preparation, numbers, and intelligence to counter his maneuvers. Where boldness once brought victory, now it led to stalemate and retreat. Rommel's failures weren't due to lack of skill. They were the result of logistical limits, environmental challenges, and a smarter, better prepared enemy. In the desert, even the Desert Fox learned that daring alone could no longer guarantee success.
In the early years of the North African campaign, the desert sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. German aircraft provided Rommel with reconnaissance, close air support, and a psychological edge. Their dominance allowed the Afrika Korps to move quickly, strike with precision, and disrupt Allied supply lines. For Rommel, control of the sky was as important as control of the desert. But by 1942, the balance began to shift. Several factors undermined German air supremacy. 1. Allied reinforcements. The Royal Air Force, RAF, received new aircraft, better training, and improved tactics. Squadrons were strategically deployed to protect supply lines, support ground troops, and challenge the Luftwaffe's dominance. Logistics and maintenance. The Luftwaffe struggled to maintain aircraft in the harsh desert environment. Sand, damaged engines, spare parts were scarce, and long supply lines made repairs difficult. The RAF, benefiting from better established bases in Egypt and Libya, could maintain more consistent air operations. Intelligence advantage. British ultra-intelligence allowed the Allies to anticipate Luftwaffe missions, positioning anti-aircraft defenses and intercepting reconnaissance efforts. Pilots began knowing when and where German aircraft would strike, reducing the element of surprise. Integration with ground forces. RAF and Allied air units became tightly coordinated with the 8th Army. Tanks and infantry movements were shielded from air attack, and close air support increasingly targeted Axis vulnerabilities. The Luftwaffe's famed mobility was constrained by the threat above. By the time of El Alamein, control of the desert sky had shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee intelligence or air support, and the Allies had achieved a new level of battlefield dominance. Air power, once Rommel's ally, had become a contested domain, and the balance in North Africa was finally tipping in favor of the British.
In the North African campaign, victory didn't just depend on tanks, men, or air power. It depended on supplies. Fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements had to flow across hundreds of miles of desert. And at the heart of this logistical struggle was a tiny, strategically critical island, Malta. Malta's location in the central Mediterranean made it the perfect base for Allied forces to intercept Axis convoys. From its harbors and airfields, British aircraft and submarines could attack ships carrying fuel, tanks, and troops from Italy to North Africa. Every convoy sunk or delayed weakened Rommel's supply lines, limiting his operational reach and slowing his offensives. The Axis powers recognized Malta's threat and subjected the island to a relentless campaign of bombing and blockade. The siege tested the resilience of both the Maltese people and the Allied garrison. Yet, despite shortages, constant air raids, and difficult conditions, Malta remained operational, continually disrupting Axis logistics. For Rommel, the consequences were severe. Even when his tactics were brilliant and his armored thrusts successful, he often lacked fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements at critical moments. Battles were fought not just against the British Eighth Army, but against a supply chain strangled by Malta's presence. The Desert Fox's mobility, a cornerstone of his strategy, was increasingly constrained by forces hundreds of miles away in the Mediterranean. Malta's role highlights a fundamental truth of warfare. The battlefield isn't just where the armies meet, it's also where supplies are stored, transported, and protected. By threatening the Axis supply chain, Malta became a silent but decisive factor in the North African campaign. The island may have been small, but its impact was enormous. In the Desert War, controlling logistics often mattered more than controlling terrain. And Malta ensured the Allies could strangle Rommel's lifeline long before tanks clashed in the sands.
When most histories of the North African campaign are told, Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps dominate the narrative. Tanks, daring maneuvers, and the Desert Fox himself often overshadow another critical element: the Italian forces fighting alongside the Germans. Italy had committed large numbers of troops, artillery, and equipment to North Africa long before Rommel's arrival. Units from the Regia Esercito held key positions in Libya and Cyrenaica, defending supply lines, fortifying desert outposts, and engaging British forces in early battles. Their presence allowed the Afrika Korps to concentrate on offensive operations, knowing that Italy provided the backbone of the Axis defensive and support structure. Italian troops faced incredible challenges. Equipment was often outdated, supply lines were stretched, and morale fluctuated under the harsh desert conditions. Despite these obstacles, they fought alongside German units, absorbing pressure, holding ground, and sometimes sacrificing heavily to allow Rommel the freedom to maneuver. Many British and Allied accounts dismissed the Italians as ineffective or poorly led. In reality, their contributions were crucial. Without the Italian divisions securing lines, guarding flanks, and maintaining garrisons, Rommel's fast-paced attacks would have been impossible to sustain. The Afrika Korps relied on this partnership, even as German sources often took the credit for victories achieved together. Ultimately, the story of the North African campaign isn't just about German brilliance. It's also about the combined Axis effort, and the Italian forces played a role that, while often overlooked, was indispensable. They were the backbone that supported Rommel's audacious strategies and kept the Axis war machine moving across the unforgiving desert.
Erwin Rommel was brilliant, bold, and fearless, a commander whose audacity became legendary. But even the Desert Fox was human, and overconfidence sometimes clouded his judgment, with consequences that shaped the North African campaign. Rommel's greatest strength was also his greatest risk, his reliance on speed, surprise, and intuition. He often assumed the British would crumble under pressure, that supply lines could stretch further than was safe, and that daring maneuvers would always succeed. Early victories reinforced this mindset, creating a sense that he could outthink and outmaneuver any opponent. Reality, however, was less forgiving.
logistics, terrain, and enemy adaptation constantly constrained his bold plans. Fuel shortages, overstretched supply lines, and the harsh desert environment often slowed operations and forced retreats even after apparent successes. The Allies, learning from previous encounters, began to anticipate Rommel's moves. Codebreaking through flexible defensive tactics and improved coordination gave them an edge he could not ignore. Overconfidence sometimes led Rommel to overextend his forces, striking too far without adequate support or supplies, leaving his units vulnerable to counterattacks. One of the clearest examples came at El Alamein, where careful preparation and superior logistics by Montgomery's forces exposed the limits of Rommel's daring. His audacious thrusts were met with fortified positions, reinforced lines, and timely counterattacks. The Desert Fox's instincts could no longer guarantee victory. Rommel's miscalculations weren't failures of skill. They were the inevitable clash between boldness and the realities of war. They show that even brilliance has limits, and that success in battle requires more than courage. It requires planning, supply, and a respect for the enemy. In the end, Rommel's genius was undeniable, but in North Africa, overconfidence was a vulnerability the Allies learned to exploit.
The North African desert wasn't just a battlefield for men, it was a testing ground for tanks. From British Grants and Crusaders to the arrival of the formidable Sherman, armored warfare became a decisive element in the struggle against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Early British tanks, like the Cruiser and Matilda, were either fast but lightly armored or slow and well protected. They often struggled against the experienced German panzer units, which combined mobility, firepower, and coordinated tactics. The British learned quickly that tank numbers alone weren't enough. Training, strategy, and integration with infantry and artillery were just as crucial. The Grant tanks, introduced in 1942, brought better firepower, allowing British forces to engage German armor more effectively. They could withstand some of the Afrika Korps' attacks and provide critical support for infantry advances. Around the same time, Crusader tanks emphasized speed, allowing for flanking maneuvers and rapid responses, though their armor remained vulnerable. The real game changer came with the Sherman tank, arriving in greater numbers later in the campaign. Combining reliability, firepower, and crew protection, the Sherman allowed the Allies to match German panzers on more equal terms. It gave commanders like Montgomery the ability to execute large-scale armored offensives with confidence, shifting the balance in the desert. Tank warfare in North Africa was more than just a contest of machines. It was a test of tactics, logistics, and coordination. Rommel's early successes relied heavily on armored mobility, but as British tanks improved and crews grew more experienced, the Desert Fox found himself facing an enemy that could meet him blow for blow.
In the North African desert, victory didn't rely solely on firepower. It also relied on tricking the enemy. Deception became an essential part of warfare, and the Allies mastered the art of making Rommel see what wasn't there. One of the most famous tactics was the use of dummy tanks and vehicles. Inflatable or wooden tanks were placed in open desert, complete with fake tracks and dust trails. From the air or a distance, they looked real, drawing German attention away from the true positions of Allied forces. These illusions forced Rommel to commit his armor to the wrong targets or hesitate when speed and surprise were crucial. The Allies also employed fake defensive lines and dummy camps. Empty trenches, dummy artillery, and even simulated troop movements created the impression of strength where none existed. Rommel, accustomed to rapid, decisive strikes, sometimes overestimated Allied numbers or misjudged where the real attacks would occur. Misdirection went beyond static decoys. The Allies used radio traffic, false intelligence and staged maneuvers to suggest operations that weren't planned. Fake supply depots, dummy convoys, and even bogus plans sent through captured channels added layers to the deception. Every trick stretched Rommel's decision-making and disrupted the timing of his attacks. These efforts culminated in operations that froze Rommel in place or forced mistakes, allowing the Allies to strike where he least expected. Deception didn't replace tanks, artillery, or air power, but it amplified their effectiveness, turning psychological warfare into a tangible battlefield advantage. In the desert, where speed and surprise mattered more than in almost any other theater, making the enemy believe the false was often as powerful as the real. Desert deception became a force multiplier, proving that brains, strategy, and creativity could shape victory as much as firepower.
By 1941, the British Eighth Army had suffered repeated defeats in North Africa. Morale was low. Supplies were stretched thin, and leadership had been inconsistent. But under new command and with a renewed strategy, the Eighth Army was about to be reborn, transforming from a beaten force into a formidable opponent for Rommel's Afrika Korps. The first step was restoring morale. Soldiers who had endured defeats were given time to regroup, train, and rebuild confidence. Leaders emphasized discipline, preparation, and the idea that victory was possible. Small successes were celebrated, and units learned to trust in their training and each other. Next came reinforcements and equipment. Fresh troops, modern tanks, artillery, and reliable supply lines arrived, addressing the logistical weaknesses that had plagued previous campaigns. Proper coordination of armor, infantry, and air support gave commanders the flexibility to execute complex operations with confidence. Finally, the Eighth Army adopted a new doctrine. Rather than relying solely on rigid defensive lines or reactive attacks, British commanders implemented the elastic defense and integrated combined arms tactics. Units could absorb attacks, fall back strategically, and launch counteroffensives at the enemy's weak points. Flexibility, coordination, and preparation became the Army's new strengths. The results were immediate. In battles like Operation Crusader and the First Battle of El Alamein, the rejuvenated Eighth Army held firm, inflicted significant losses on the Axis, and showed that Rommel's previously unstoppable forces could be checked. The rebirth of the British Eighth Army wasn't just about numbers or equipment. It was about confidence, strategy, and adaptability. By addressing morale, reinforcements, and doctrine, the British turned a struggling army into a resilient force capable of challenging the Desert Fox on equal terms.
Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was famous for his daring tactics, rapid advances, and almost preternatural battlefield instincts. But behind the legend lay a human cost that is often overlooked: exhaustion, illness, and the relentless pressures of command. By 1942, Rommel had been fighting nearly non-stop for 2 years in the harsh North African desert. Long hours, constant decision-making, and the stress of commanding an overstretched army took a toll on his health. Heat, sand, and lack of rest combined with the pressure of a determined enemy to weaken even the most resilient commanders. Illness struck Rommel at critical moments. He suffered from dysentery, exhaustion, and other stress-related ailments, forcing him to delegate responsibilities and slow operations at times. His famed mobility and rapid decision-making, once unmatched, became harder to sustain. Even the Desert Fox was vulnerable to the physical and mental toll of prolonged warfare. Exhaustion also affected his judgment. Supply shortages, overstretched lines, and constant Allied pressure meant that Rommel was often making decisions under extreme stress, increasing the risk of miscalculations.
While his audacity remained, the human limits of endurance became a strategic factor on the battlefield. The North African campaign demonstrates that wars are not fought by machines alone. Leaders and soldiers alike endure fatigue, illness, and the constant stress of life and death decisions. For Rommel, the human cost of command was a hidden enemy, one that no tank, aircraft, or artillery could fight. Even the Desert Fox had limits. His illness and exhaustion remind us that behind every legendary commander lies a human being, vulnerable to the same pressures, weaknesses, and strains as the men he led.
Erwin Rommel was a brilliant field commander, renowned for his audacity and tactical genius in North Africa. But even the Desert Fox had limits, and sometimes those limits were imposed from Berlin. Hitler's interference in military operations increasingly hampered the Africa Corps and contributed to its eventual defeat. From the start, Hitler's directives emphasized bold, aggressive action, often without regard for logistics, terrain, or supply lines. Rommel was ordered to push forward, seize objectives quickly, and hold territory at almost any cost. While this aligned with his natural style, it ignored the realities of desert warfare, stretching his forces thin and leaving them vulnerable. Hitler also restricted withdrawals and imposed unrealistic timelines. Even when Rommel recognized the need to regroup or preserve his army, he was forced to advance under pressure from high command. The insistence on offensive action over strategic patience turned temporary tactical victories into long-term overextensions. Communication between Berlin and North Africa was slow and often disconnected from the frontline realities. Orders were based on reports that were out of date or overly optimistic, leaving Rommel to reconcile ambitious directives with harsh desert conditions and dwindling supplies. As the campaign progressed, Hitler's interference became even more problematic. Key decisions, such as holding ground at El Alamein or prioritizing offensive operations over securing supply lines, undermined Rommel's operational flexibility. The Desert Fox, brilliant as he was, could not compensate for the mismatch between Berlin's expectations and the realities on the ground. In the end, the Africa Corps suffered not only from Allied pressure, but from the strategic micromanagement of Hitler, which limited Rommel's options and compounded logistical and tactical challenges. Berlin's interference turned audacity into vulnerability, showing that even the greatest commanders can be constrained and sometimes doomed by orders from above.
After the decisive Allied victories at El Alamein and in the air, Rommel and the Afrika Korps faced the harsh reality, a long, grueling retreat across the deserts of North Africa. What had once been a campaign of bold advances became a fight for survival. The retreat stretched from Egypt, across Libya, and into Tunisia, covering hundreds of miles of unforgiving desert. Logistics, already a constant challenge, became even more critical. Fuel shortages, damaged vehicles, and disrupted supply lines forced the Axis to abandon positions, leaving behind equipment and even troops. Allied forces pursued relentlessly. Montgomery's 8th Army, supported by improved intelligence, artillery, and air power, kept pressure on the retreating Germans. Every step of the way, the Desert Fox had to make tough decisions: which units to risk, which positions to hold, and how to delay the Allies without losing cohesion. The desert itself added to the suffering. Troops endured extreme heat by day, freezing nights, sandstorms, and a constant shortage of water and supplies. Morale suffered as losses mounted, and the dream of conquering Egypt faded into a desperate fight to reach Tunisia. Despite the retreat, Rommel's skillful leadership allowed his forces to maintain some order, conduct effective rearguard actions, and preserve enough strength for future defensive battles. Yet the long withdrawal marked a turning point,
The momentum had shifted irreversibly to the Allies, and the Afrika Korps could no longer dictate the pace of war in North Africa. The journey from Egypt to Tunisia was not just a movement of troops. It was a strategic collapse, a testament to the limits of audacity when confronted with supply shortages, determined enemies, and the relentless desert. It set the stage for the final battles that would end Axis ambitions in North Africa.
The North African campaign is often remembered as a clash not only of armies, but of personalities and command philosophies. At the center were two legendary figures, Erwin Rommel, the audacious desert fox, and Bernard Montgomery, the meticulous British strategist. Rommel thrived on speed, intuition, and daring maneuvers. He preferred to make decisions on the battlefield, exploiting weaknesses with rapid armored thrusts and lightning raids. His leadership inspired boldness in his troops, and his ability to read the battlefield often allowed him to seize opportunities that others would miss. Audacity was his tool, instinct his guide. Montgomery, by contrast, relied on careful planning, preparation, and coordination. He emphasized logistics, intelligence, and morale, ensuring that every offensive had clear objectives and strong support. His leadership style instilled confidence and discipline, allowing the British Eighth Army to hold firm against even the most aggressive attacks. Patience and calculation were his weapons, organization his strength. The contrast went beyond tactics. Rommel led from the front, sharing risks with his soldiers, often living dangerously close to the action. Montgomery led from command posts, analyzing maps, coordinating artillery and air support, and ensuring that his forces were positioned for maximum effect. One relied on instinct, the other on preparation. One on boldness, the other on methodical control. Their differing philosophies shaped every major battle in North Africa. Rommel's brilliance could overwhelm unprepared opponents, but Montgomery's meticulous approach absorbed and countered those attacks, turning audacity into vulnerability. Where Rommel gambled, Monty calculated. Where Rommel struck fast, Monty waited for the perfect moment. The Desert War became as much a battle of minds as of tanks and artillery. The clash between Rommel and Montgomery was a study in leadership, showing how personality, style, and command philosophy can influence the outcome of war. In the end, it wasn't just armies that determined victory. It was the men who led them.
Erwin Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox has endured for decades. Tales of audacious maneuvers, rapid advances, and near-miraculous escapes painted him as almost invincible. But how much of that was myth, and how much reflected reality? Rommel's successes were undeniable. His tactical brilliance, speed, and ability to inspire troops often allowed him to outmaneuver the British Eighth Army. Early campaigns in North Africa made it seem as though he could strike anywhere, anytime, and the Allies were powerless to stop him. Yet, beneath the legend, there were limits and vulnerabilities. Logistics constantly constrained his operations. Fuel shortages, overstretched supply lines, and harsh desert conditions frequently slowed or halted his advances. Even the Desert Fox could not overcome material shortages or environmental challenges. Allied adaptation further exposed the gap between myth and reality. Improved intelligence through Ultra, the arrival of superior tanks and leaders like Montgomery allowed the British to anticipate Rommel's moves, absorb attacks, and counterattack effectively. Over time, his audacity was met with preparation, discipline, and overwhelming force. Rommel's invincibility also ignored the human cost. Illness, exhaustion, and constant stress affected decision-making, while Berlin's interference imposed unrealistic demands. Many of his gambles succeeded not purely through genius,
but because the Allies were underprepared or fortunate in some circumstances. The truth is nuanced. Rommel was extraordinarily skilled, but not invincible. His legend grew because boldness is memorable, while supply problems, tactical failures, and retreats are often overlooked. The Desert Fox was a brilliant commander operating under severe constraints, whose victories were impressive but not miraculous. In North Africa, Rommel teaches a critical lesson. Even the most skilled leaders are limited by logistics, environment, and an adaptable enemy. Myth may glorify audacity, but reality always checks it.
In the early stages of the North African campaign, Rommel's rapid advances seemed unstoppable. Yet one target resisted him for months: the port city of Tobruk. Its stubborn defense became a thorn in the Desert Fox's side and a key factor in slowing the Axis advance. Tobruk's strategic importance was clear. Its deep-water port allowed the Allies to supply and reinforce troops along the front, serving as a vital logistical hub. Capturing it would have eased Rommel's supply problems and opened the road to Egypt. But the defenders, a mix of Australian, British, and other Commonwealth troops, were determined and well prepared. Rommel's forces launched repeated assaults, expecting the port to fall quickly. Instead, the defenders used well-fortified positions, clever defensive tactics, and constant counterattacks to repel attacks. Every advance by the Afrika Korps was met with stubborn resistance, mines, and artillery fire. Tobruk's defenders turned a seemingly minor port into a symbol of defiance. The siege had strategic consequences. While Rommel was tied down trying to capture Tobruk, his supply lines were stretched even thinner, and the Allies had time to regroup further east. The delay disrupted the timing of his offensives and allowed Montgomery and others to plan more robust defenses. Tobruk's resistance demonstrated that even the Desert Fox could be slowed by tenacity, preparation, and determination. The siege wasn't a glamorous battle of tanks and daring raids. It was a grueling test of endurance, planning, and courage that ultimately shaped the course of the North African campaign. In the end, Tobruk became more than a port. It was a symbol of how discipline and resolve could blunt even the most feared commander in the desert.
The North African campaign is often remembered for daring maneuvers, Rommel's audacity, and tank battles across the desert. But beyond the drama of individual battles, the Desert War had strategic importance far greater than most people realize. Control of North Africa meant control of the Mediterranean. The Suez Canal, a critical artery for Allied supply lines to Asia and the Middle East, depended on a stable North Africa. Losing it would have cut off Britain from vital resources, troops, and trade, potentially altering the entire course of the war. The campaign also tested logistics, intelligence, and combined arms coordination on a massive scale. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across desert terrain, making fuel, water, and ammunition as decisive as tanks and guns. Intelligence breakthroughs like Ultra proved that information could be just as lethal as firepower. The lessons learned in North Africa shaped Allied strategy for later campaigns in Europe and beyond. Moreover, the Desert War tied down significant Axis resources. Troops, tanks, and aircraft committed to North Africa were unavailable for the Eastern Front or other theaters. The campaign bought the Allies time to regroup, reinforce, and prepare for future offensives, including the eventual invasion of Italy and Normandy. Finally, the Desert Campaign was a battle of morale and perception. Victories like El Alamein boosted Allied confidence, proving that even the feared Desert Fox could be stopped. Conversely, Axis setbacks revealed the limits of audacity and highlighted the importance of preparation and coordination. In short, the Desert War was not just a sideshow. It was a decisive theater where logistics, leadership, and strategy intersected.
and where the outcomes shaped the broader trajectory of World War II. The sands of North Africa mattered not only for their battles, but for the global consequences they carried.
The outcome of the North African campaign, and indeed much of World War II, was shaped not just by generals or soldiers, but by logistics on a global scale. Behind every victory was a vast network of supplies, reinforcements, and industrial output, with American industry playing a decisive role. From tanks and trucks to rifles, fuel, and ammunition, the United States produced war material at a scale the world had never seen. These resources flowed through the Atlantic into the Mediterranean and ultimately to the desert battlefields. Without this steady stream, the British Eighth Army would have struggled to maintain operations against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The impact of American production went beyond simple numbers. Modern tanks like the M3 Grant and later Sherman, trucks to move troops and supplies, and advanced artillery allowed the Allies to match and eventually surpass German firepower. Fuel shipments kept the desert's mechanized armies moving, while spare parts and repair equipment ensured vehicles remained operational under harsh conditions. Logistics also meant the Allies could sustain prolonged operations, reinforcing successes and absorbing setbacks. Supply convoys, often harassed by Axis aircraft and submarines, became lifelines. The ability to replace losses quickly and efficiently gave Allied commanders a strategic flexibility that Rommel increasingly lacked. In essence, the Desert War was not fought solely with tanks and guns. It was fought with planning, production, and distribution on a global scale. American industry, combined with British organizational skill, ensured that the Allies could maintain pressure, exploit opportunities, and ultimately turn the tide in North Africa. The lesson is clear: wars are won not only on the battlefield, but in factories, ports, and supply chains. In the desert, where every gallon of fuel and every shell counted, logistics became a weapon as powerful as any tank or artillery battery.
By early 1943, the tide in North Africa had turned decisively against the Axis. Supplies were low, the Allies held the initiative, and Rommel faced an increasingly impossible situation. Yet the Desert Fox was never one to surrender quietly. He launched one final offensive, a last desperate gamble to regain momentum. Rommel's plan relied on speed, surprise, and audacity, his trademarks in earlier campaigns. Despite dwindling fuel, worn-out vehicles, and exhausted troops, he sought to strike quickly, hoping to disrupt Allied supply lines and force a breakthrough. The operation was high risk. Success might buy time and relieve pressure. Failure would seal the fate of the Afrika Korps. The Allies, however, were prepared. Montgomery and his commanders had consolidated forces, reinforced positions, and improved coordination between infantry, armor, and air support. Intelligence, including ultra-intercepts, revealed much of Rommel's intentions, allowing the Eighth Army to anticipate and counter the offensive. Despite initial advances, Rommel's forces were unable to achieve decisive gains. Supply shortages, harsh desert conditions, and relentless Allied resistance slowed the attack. Units became overstretched, and the Desert Fox's signature boldness was checked by the reality of logistics and a superior enemy numbers. The failed offensive marked the beginning of the end for the Afrika Korps in North Africa. Rommel was forced into a continuous retreat, ultimately leading to the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia. His last gamble demonstrated his tactical brilliance, but also the limits imposed by strategy, supply, and an adaptive opponent. Rommel's final North African offensive is a lesson in courage under constraint. Even a genius commander cannot overcome exhaustion, logistical limits, and a determined, well-prepared enemy. It was the Desert Fox's last roll of the dice, and this time
The desert had the final say.
War isn't fought only with tanks, guns, or planes. It is also fought in the minds of soldiers and civilians. In North Africa, psychological warfare played a critical role, shaping perceptions, morale, and decision-making on both sides. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox was a weapon in itself. Stories of his audacious maneuvers, rapid advances, and near-miraculous escapes spread fear among Allied troops and even influenced enemy strategy. Propaganda amplified his image, making every encounter feel like a confrontation with an almost invincible opponent. The Allies, in turn, used propaganda to boost morale and undermine the enemy. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and news reports highlighted victories, mocked Axis setbacks, and emphasized the resilience of British and Commonwealth forces. Soldiers who believed in their cause and leadership were more likely to hold positions, regroup after defeats, and fight with determination. Psychological tactics extended to battlefield deception as well. Dummy tanks, fake supply depots, and feigned maneuvers played on the enemy's expectations and fears, forcing commanders to second-guess plans and divert resources unnecessarily. Intelligence, rumors, and misinformation all became tools to manipulate perception. The war of the mind influenced outcomes as much as any physical battle. Rommel's fearsome reputation sometimes worked to his advantage, but when the Allies adapted, prepared, and resisted intimidation, psychological leverage diminished. Conversely, Allied propaganda and deception strengthened cohesion and confidence, turning perception into a tangible force multiplier. The North African campaign demonstrates that psychology is as much a battlefield as sand, tanks, and artillery. Morale, reputation, and fear shaped decisions, altered strategies, and determined the success or failure of entire campaigns. In the desert, the mind could be just as deadly as any weapon. By May 1943, the North African campaign had reached its conclusion. Months of retreats, supply shortages, and relentless Allied pressure had weakened the Axis forces to the breaking point. The once feared Africa Corps, led by the legendary Desert Fox, faced its final chapter. Rommel, already reassigned to Europe due to illness and injury, was no longer present to lead his troops. Those left behind struggled to hold positions against overwhelming British, American, and Commonwealth forces. Logistics had collapsed, morale had plummeted, and the Axis had no viable path to regroup. The final Allied offensives in Tunisia sealed the fate of the Africa Corps. Units surrendered en masse, with tens of thousands of soldiers taken prisoner. Equipment, vehicles, and artillery that had once struck fear into the Allies were abandoned or destroyed. The Desert Fox's carefully orchestrated maneuvers could no longer compensate for the strategic reality. The Axis was defeated in North Africa. The surrender marked more than a military loss. It was a symbolic end to the Axis campaign in the Mediterranean. Control of North Africa shifted entirely to the Allies, opening the way for the invasion of Sicily and Italy, and securing vital supply routes through the Mediterranean. The end of the Africa Corps illustrates a fundamental truth of war. Tactical brilliance can delay defeat, but logistical collapse, overwhelming opposition, and strategic overreach are ultimately decisive. Rommel's legacy endured, but the Desert War had run its course, leaving the Allies victorious and the Axis expelled from North Africa forever. The North African campaign was more than a series of battles across sand and rock. It was a turning point in World War II. Rommel's defeat had consequences that reverberated far beyond the desert, shaping strategy, morale, and the future of the Allied war effort. With the surrender of the Africa Corps in Tunisia, the Allies gained full control of North Africa.
This secured vital Mediterranean supply routes, safeguarded the Suez Canal, and allowed for the planning of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, which ultimately opened the way to liberating Italy. Rommel's failure also demonstrated the limits of tactical brilliance against strategic preparation. While audacity and speed had won him victories earlier, the combination of logistics, intelligence, and disciplined command proved decisive. The lessons learned in North Africa informed Allied operations in Europe, from combined arms coordination to deception tactics. Morale and perception were equally affected. The defeat of the Desert Fox shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding the Axis in the Mediterranean and gave the Allies a psychological boost that carried into future campaigns. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike understood that the tide of the war could turn. Finally, the Desert War highlighted the importance of global logistics and industrial might. Allied success depended on sustained supply lines, reinforcements from America, and careful planning, factors that became central to the broader war effort. Rommel's defeat underscored that wars are won not just with skill, but with preparation, resources, and strategy. The legacy of the North African campaign is clear. It was a proving ground, a turning point, and a lesson in how audacity alone cannot overcome strategic reality. Rommel's desert campaigns remain legendary, but his defeat helped shape the path to Allied victory in Europe and beyond.